Tonight on KQED Newsroom, Californians voted in record numbers this election. We'll talk through the winners and losers of state and local races and measures with our insightful politics team. And the presidential race is still too close to call, though Democratic candidate Joe Biden is leading in key battleground states. Our experts analyze the ongoing fight for the White House. Plus, we wander to the North Bay to fill our eyes with the old town charm of Benicia. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. And now for KQED Newsroom's Election 2020 coverage. Let's begin with state and local election news. Californians handed delivery and ride-hailing companies a big win for their gig worker policies, with Prop 22 winning by more than 58%. Markets responded by sending stocks soaring for Uber and Lyft. Prop 16, which would have allowed affirmative action in public hiring and admission decisions, failed. Criminal justice measures across the Bay Area are leading, potentially strengthening independent oversight of law enforcement. Despite a spirited challenge, San Francisco's State Senator Scott Wiener retained his seat for another 4 years. In Silicon Valley, Dave Cortese is leading in his state Senate race against Ann Ravel. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco is KQED Politics and Government Senior Editor Scott Schaefer, and also joining by Skype from San Francisco is KQED Politics and Government Correspondent Marisa Lagos. Thank you both for joining us. Scott, this election is projected to set a state record for the number of votes cast. Do you see any particular impact from that record turnout?
Well, certainly for Joe Biden, he's going to get a massive historic margin out of California right now with 4 million ballots still to count. He's got a 4 million plus lead over Donald Trump, so that'll help pad his national advantage that he already has. In terms of the ballot measures, it's kind of hard to say because it was really a mixed bag. If you go down the list of ballot measures, Californians embraced things like criminal justice reform and Prop 20. They rejected rolling those things back. They endorsed giving parolees the right to vote, expanding consumer privacy, but at the same time, they rejected Prop 15, which would have raised property taxes on commercial properties. They also rejected, obviously, affirmative action with Prop 16, and maybe most importantly of all, they accepted Prop 22. They rejected labor's argument against Prop 22 and voted to support Lyft and Uber and the other gig companies.
Well, let's dig into those a little bit. Let's start with Prop 16. Marisa, that one was going to bring back affirmative action. We noticed for a while it wasn't on track to succeed, and it did fail. Can you talk us through what happened and why?
I think this is something that the campaign is going to be talking about for a while. I mean, it's impossible to get in all the millions of voters' minds. But what we saw in polling, which did really play out in terms of the final numbers or the semifinal numbers, is that this just didn't resonate with people. I don't think the campaign was successful in making this connection between Black Lives Matter and the sort of racial reckoning that we're having and this. There seems to be a lot of confusion, even among Latinos, voters of color, about what this would do, whether it would benefit them. And I think that affirmative action, just as a sort of statement, has a lot of baggage attached to it. I do think that, we're going to see, and if the polling plays out, that younger voters were more likely to support it, but it certainly wasn't the victory that I think proponents had hoped when the legislature put this on the ballot, really as those protests were roiling the nation in June.
And Scott, the most expensive proposition in state history, Prop 22, won. This vote means that gig workers do not need to become full-time employees, but union leaders say they're not done with this fight. Is there anything they actually can do now that voters have weighed in?
Well, it's not really clear. I mean, obviously they're at a disadvantage and they're playing defense. Drivers filed a class action discrimination lawsuit saying that the app and the rating system is biases against drivers of color. They may be hoping that when Joe Biden gets into the White House, that they can go to the Labor Department and get some more favorable rulings, maybe some more national guidelines that would help these drivers organize, for example, but I think it's going to be very tough. And, really the big loss for organized labor is that this is now going to become a national conversation. The gig economy is expanding everywhere, not just here in California. And I think companies like Uber and Lyft are going to take Prop 22 elsewhere and try to use it as a model, as a template to replicate what voters here have done in carving out this exception in California labor law. So, they don't have a lot of really good options, I have to say.
Yeah, well, one of California's biggest export is our ideas. So I think we will be seeing that nationally come up. Marisa, there were a couple of proposals related to housing, both rent control and property taxes for business owners. So what does the vote on those measures say about our perspective on housing here in California and what we're willing to actually do about affordability issues?
So this may not always be a popular opinion, but I actually think in some ways when you look at this ballot, you can't necessarily make broad, sort of brushstrokes. Oh, are Californians progressive? Are they business? Are they labor? I think what we've seen historically with ballot measures is that Californians really do take their time and look at them individually. I think Proposition 21, the rent control measure, was always an uphill battle. Rent control has always been controversial in California. I think what you see historically is that even though we're very progressive on some social issues, when it comes to economics, there's usually a split among property owners and renters, for example. And in this case, it was also run by a very unpopular figure, Michael Weinstein, the head of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I think he really got undercut by Democrats in the legislature passing a more mild version of rental protection this year, which led to people like Governor Gavin Newsom not supporting this. So I think that's an example. And he also got outspent. He spent a lot of money, but he got outspent. I think on Prop 15, similarly, with the exception of affirmative action, I think almost every single ballot measure that won, they outspent their opponents. And I think that you can't look at that in a vacuum. I also think with Prop 15 that commercial property tax increase, you had a very complicated situation for proponents when we're in this recession, when there's so much uncertainty, and when Californians have always been very reticent to roll back any portion of Prop 13. And I think they played into the fears of homeowners that any opening of that 1978 ballot measure could lead to their properties going up, not just commercial properties.
All right, Scott, you spent some time this week with Governor Newsom and several other elected officials who were phone banking and texting at Manny's in San Francisco. What were their targets and how successful did they seem to be in persuading voters?
I think Gavin Newsom texted maybe 2 or 3 people. He spent a lot of time talking, as did others. He told me when I asked him where he was texting, he said Pennsylvania, that's all that matters. So who knows? Maybe he reached a few voters who were on the fence. But really, this was an opportunity to, for him and others in the Bay Area. There were 2 mayors there, London Breed and Libby Schaaf. Jackie Spear was there, Barbara Lee from the East Bay, local members of the legislature. So I think this was really just basically, to give the media something to do, frankly, on Election Day. He did talk about things like who he would name to replace Kamala Harris if the Biden-Harris ticket is successful, but he was really there, I think, just to kind of shake hands. And he talked to a mom with some young babies. So, that's the thing, that the bread and butter for politicians.
And no particular update on who Gavin Newsom would appoint to Kamala Harris's seat should she move into the White House. Let's turn to some of the state Senate races. Marisa, State Senator Scott Wiener faced a young challenger to his left, Jackie Fielder. She lost, but she's being hailed as a smart young leader who will probably be successful in a future bid for office. What does that race tell us about the strength of progressives in California?
I think it says a lot. You really can't understate. This is a 25-year-old woman, unknown really politically before this year, who threw her hat into the ring only about 11 months ago, and really had a great showing. I think excited a lot of folks who are in the sort of Bernie Sanders camp of the Republican Party here in San Francisco. Look, they're both progressive Democrats. I know that in San Francisco, Scott gets painted as more of a business-friendly Democrat, but if you look at his vote record in Sacramento, he is very far to the left. He's also much more well-known than her. He was on the Board of Supervisors. He's got the support of the establishment. So I agree that this is not necessarily a loss for Fielder in the sense that she has raised her name ID, really excited a coalition of progressive Democrats in San Francisco, and I think we'll be hearing from her again.
And Scott, in the South Bay, Dave Cortese is leading over his competitor, Ann Ravel. Would you tell us a little about why that race has been so closely watched and what Cortese's lead signifies?
Yeah, well, Dave Cortese is very well known in Santa Clara County. He's a member of the Board of Supervisors. He was on the city council. He ran unsuccessfully against Sam Liccardo for mayor. He's very tight with organized labor. And Ann Ravel, these are both Democrats. But, as we've seen in Sacramento, as Republicans have receded, you have some more moderate Democrats. And Ann Rabel, I would say, was a little bit more in that vein. She was endorsed by President Obama because he had appointed her to serve on the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. She also served as the county counsel for Santa Clara County. So not as well known as Cortese, but, again, that kind of power dynamic between the more moderate, business-friendly Democrats in Ann Rabel and the more labor-friendly, maybe better known in terms of David Cortese. And obviously, Cortese does seem to be winning that seat, and he'll be going to Sacramento most likely.
All right, Marissa, in the Bay Area, 6 criminal justice reform measures look likely to prevail. If you look at these as a whole, what changes should we expect to see?
Well, I think that this is really in concert with what we've seen around criminal justice reform, which is local voters and really even statewide voters with the defeat of Prop 20 far more willing to kind of go further than state lawmakers are to take on police unions, to take on the status quo in law enforcement. These are all essentially broad brushstrokes, police accountability and oversight measures. In San Francisco, for example, the sheriff's department will have oversight for the first time ever. So I think that this is a real win for criminal justice reform advocates. I think it will put some pressure on state lawmakers to look a little more closely at some of these reform issues that the governor has promised we will revisit next year. But again, I think it really just speaks to how much further ahead the electorate has been in California, really over the past 10, 15 years on questions of both criminal justice reform and police accountability. And I think that grassroots support is going to continue to spread throughout the state.
Scott, in Stockton, incumbent Mayor Michael Tubbs, who's been a fairly popular young Democratic, superstar in some ways within the Democratic Party, he's trailing his Republican challenger, Kevin Lincoln. Does that surprise you?
That was a shock. I think everyone assumed he would just kind of coast to re-election. He won with 70% of the vote last time. It was not really on the radar of the media, and that might have been part of his problem. The Stockton Record, the newspaper there, has had a lot of layoffs, and there's a new online news organization called the 209 Times, 209 being the area code. It's run by a real opponent of Mayor Tubbs, and there was a real stream of negative articles online about him, alleging corruption without any evidence, and apparently it influenced voters there. Kevin Lincoln, African-American, more conservative, he's a Republican, is ahead by about 52-48. We'll see. There's still some more votes to be counted. But yeah, Michael Tubbs was really seen as a rising star. Barack Obama had endorsed him. There was a documentary done about him that was seen on HBO. So a real surprising outcome if the current margin holds.
And Marisa, former San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon has won over the incumbent DA in Los Angeles, Jackie Lacey. Gascon was down 20 points at one time. So what changed in that race to give him the win?
I think a couple things happened. We did see a lot of national support from criminal justice reformers and a real grassroots effort on the ground. He was essentially talked into running to some extent by folks down there who really saw Jackie Lacey, although she's a Democrat, as not representing the future of criminal justice in California. I think also we've seen a little bit of a leftward tilt in Los Angeles County generally. They're going to have their first all-female board of supervisors after State Senator Holly Mitchell took out longtime politician down there, Herb Wesson, also both Democrats. But I do think that we saw a lot of on-the-ground organizing. LA has not always been as sort of politically engaged as San Francisco, and maybe that's changing.
The always insightful Marisa Lagos and Scott Schaefer with KQED. Thank you both.
Thank you.
For the latest California state and local election results, visit kqed.org/elections/results. We may have been mentally prepared for Election Day to turn into Election Week, but as vote counts drag on and legal challenges grow, many of us are still becoming weary of the uncertainty over who will be the next president of the United States. Vice President Joe Biden has resoundingly won the popular vote by more than 4 million votes over President Trump. As of Friday afternoon, he was also leading in Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. But with a razor-thin lead in Georgia, a recount will take place there. President Trump and his supporters have made baseless claims of voter fraud, and his campaign has filed lawsuits over ballot counting in key battleground states. Joining us now by Skype from Mountain View is Lanhee Chen, a fellow at the Hoover Institution and former advisor to the presidential campaigns of Mitt Romney and Marco Rubio. And joining by Skype from Los Angeles is Jessica Levinson, a professor at the Loyola Law School and host of the Passing Judgment podcast. Thank you both for joining us today. We appreciate it. Jessica, let's start with the legal challenges President Trump has mounted in various states. Do you see any of them as having the strength to prevail?
I don't at this point. Of course, what you need in a legal challenge is you have to find a provision of a law that's been violated, and then you have to find evidence to support that assertion. At this point, I'm not sure that I see that in any of the cases, and that's why, frankly, President Trump's legal team is having such a bad batting average, why a number of the cases have been dismissed or they've just failed to continue with those cases. Now, the real question I think a lot of people have is there a case in a state that's outcome determinative where the case itself could determine the outcome of that state? And at this point, I think the answer is no. You know, the hypothetical would be, of course, that everything comes down to Pennsylvania, and then Pennsylvania comes down to just a few late arriving ballots, and then those late arriving ballots are subject to challenge, and this could potentially go all the way to the Supreme Court. I don't see that perfect storm right now. I don't see that Bush versus Gore moment right now.
Lanhee, the Trump campaign isn't accepting the election results in some of the key battleground states. Does the president have Republican Party support in his continued fight for the White House?
Well, if he does, it's dwindling. There are certainly some Republicans who continue to stand with the president, but what I've observed over the last couple of hours and days is that the number of Republicans who are willing certainly to go all the way with the president, who are willing, for example, to endorse his notion that there's been widespread voter fraud or that somehow the counting ought to stop in one state or another, that is not something I find supported by the broad majority of Republicans. And in fact, you're hearing more and more Republican officials now beginning to pull the ripcord, if you will, to try and cut those ties and to try to express their own concerns about some of the president's claims and the impact of those claims on our ability to trust in the electoral process and in American democracy more broadly.
What's your response, Lanhee, to those who say that President Trump's anger over mail-in ballots is misplaced, that he should instead be directing his anger to fellow Republicans in state legislatures that restricted the counting of mail-in ballots before Election Day?
Well, first of all, you know, the president, as I understand it himself, he voted early. He didn't vote by mail, but he voted early. He sort of clumped in a lot of his criticisms of early voting and vote by mail, and then he tried to disaggregate those complaints, and that was a little bit confusing. Look, at the end of the day, what we saw this year in the electoral process was a process that in most states, in the vast majority of situations, worked extremely well. Even where you had counts that began late, yes, it took time for Pennsylvania, for example, to process its count. We're seeing the same thing in Arizona and Nevada and other states. Can there be improvements made? Of course, there can be and there should be. And Republicans and Democrats in state legislatures need to look to changes to state law, for example, that would allow votes to be counted earlier. But the president himself, unfortunately, sowed so much disinformation, so much discord into the process that I fear that for many Republicans, it's going to be difficult to bring this back. So hopefully over the next couple of years, we can have a process of trying to repair some of the damage here that's been done.
Well, one of the president's big wins over the last several years has been the Supreme Court and his nominees there. He's indicated he's going to take this fight to the Supreme Court. Jessica, do you see there actually being a role for the Supreme Court? For example, today, the GOP in Pennsylvania petitioned it to stop counting mail-in ballots received after Election Day. Is there a legal argument there?
I don't think that there's a winning one at best, but you did mention something that is so important, and not just now, but going forward, which is President Trump has really remade the federal bench. And he has nominated now a third of the Supreme Court. And I think that's largely in part why establishment Republicans stayed with him, because they might have not liked fill in the blank XYZ, but he was so enormously effective at remaking the branch. Now, in terms of your question about could this make it all the way to the Supreme Court? At this point, I don't see it. Again, what you would need is a case like the one in Pennsylvania that you mentioned, where it goes through either the state Supreme Court, the trial court level, the Court of Appeals, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and then if there's a question of federal law, it jumps over to the U.S. Supreme Court, or a case where it goes up the federal system, trial, Court of Appeals, U.S. Supreme Court. You would still need 4 members of the U.S. Supreme Court in almost every case to agree to take that case. And then you would need at least 5 members, of course, to make a decision that would be favorable to President Trump. I know that it was very important to him to have Justice Barrett on the court before the election in case there was any litigation. My two suspicions right now, number one, that I don't think there is that big litigation that reaches the Supreme Court. And number two, I don't think that it is a lock that everybody who was appointed by President Trump would vote in a way that would get him a favorable outcome. I know this might sound naive, but there is still a difference between having a conservative legal philosophy and wanting a Republican political win. Those two things don't always map onto each other.
Well, I think you're also very right when you say that Republicans didn't leave him, despite perhaps their concerns about some of his behavior. We saw that obviously through the vote and how split the country is. Lanhee, do you have some thoughts on why the polling, once again, seemed to be so off, especially when they were trying to gauge voters' preferences for Trump in swing states?
Well, let's remember, polls are a snapshot in time, first of all, but second of all, they reflect assumptions from the pollster about who's actually going to show up to vote. So if the composition of the electorate is off, the poll is going to be off. One of the things the Trump campaign has said all along was that they were looking to remake the electorate. They were looking to introduce voters that maybe had never voted before, whether in the upper Midwest or in places like Miami-Dade County in Florida. And as it turns out, they did that. They actually introduced folks into the electorate who had not voted before, who disproportionately supported President Trump. So pollsters were looking to partisan compositions of the electorate on election day that frankly were not accurate. And I think that in part was one of the reasons why you saw a lot of pollsters miss on key states like Florida. It also reflects certain assumptions I think that pollsters themselves have about the nature of the electorate, the nature of support for President Trump. So I think that the pollsters and the polling industry, they have to take a good hard look at what went wrong this time around. I suspect when we are all said and done, they won't be too far off on the national popular vote as they weren't in 2016. But it just proves how hard it is to poll in some of these states where it's difficult to get an effective response rate or in some cases effective assumptions about who's going to be there on election day.
Well, let's move to some of the other races. I mean, Jessica, Democrats had their hopes dashed in Senate races across the country. They weren't able to pick up the seats they expected, and they face a pretty narrow path to flip control of the Senate. And there are these two races that are likely to head to a runoff in Georgia. Was that surprising to you?
I would love to say, oh, no, not at all. I completely called that. But it was a bit surprising. And maybe I did buy into some of the polling. And I also bought into some of the money. There were a couple of Democratic challengers who were really, really well funded. And I thought that there were some people like maybe Susan Collins or Lindsey Graham. And I looked at the polling and I looked at the amount of money that their opponents were raising. And I looked at what was happening in the world and I thought maybe there's a chance here. It does show, of course, my naivete. There wasn't a chance, and there is such power of name recognition, such power of incumbency. In terms of what's going to happen in Georgia, of course, it's not a done deal. Huge implications for if there is a President Biden, not a Vice President Biden, huge implications for his term going forward if Democrats control the Senate. At this point, I would say that's really a very big if.
Well, Democrats are still expected to hang on to their majority in the House, but Lanhee, Republicans picked up at least 6 seats in House races. What part of the Republican agenda do you see as the most significant in winning those seats and attracting votes?
I actually do think that even though members of the House don't have anything to do with Supreme Court nominations and confirmations, I do think that the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett and that process certainly reminded a lot of Republican voters about the value of having some kind of Republican representation. They may not have wanted to vote for President Trump, and so they split their tickets. They voted for Biden, and they supported down ballot House and Senate candidates. I also think, some of the president's remarks about what Joe Biden was going to do in terms of energy policy, in terms of other areas of policy where they may have felt, a lot of these voters may have felt, look, that sounds awfully extreme to me. They may have decided to go with a Republican down ticket as a check on a President Biden. So I think there's any number of different things going on here, but quite obviously Republicans vastly outperformed expectations. When you look at the House, they certainly have looked to have outperformed expectations on the Senate side and appear on the inside track. to hold a majority in the Senate, which I don't think anybody would have thought possible as recently as last week.
All right, let's say Joe Biden wins. Let's say he goes into the White House without Senate support because the Republicans keep their majority. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, could simply refuse to bring Biden's items to a vote in the Senate. So, Jessica, first, are you expecting gridlock for the next 4 years?
I am expecting some level of gridlock. Of course, Republicans and Democrats have different ideological backgrounds and different philosophies for how they want to achieve certain goals. So the question is how much gridlock? I think that Vice President Biden, if he becomes President Biden, will want to work with Senate Majority Leader. And I think the Senate, there's some things that we need to get done in the short term. The question will be whether or not those long-term goals, everybody can come together and have some sort of consensus. My guess is that it leaves everybody wanting a little bit more, but it's not just merely obstruction for an entire term.
Lan He.
I'm relatively optimistic. I think there are ways in which a Republican Senate can be very useful for a President Biden. First of all, there's history there working together. You know, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden know each other from their time in the Senate. I think that relationship will be useful in terms of getting things done that need to get done, whether it's infrastructure or health care or the economy. But I also think a Republican Senate gives Joe Biden an important foil in trying to hold off the progressive left. Biden was never interested in doing single-payer health care or the Green New Deal, and now he has the Republican Senate basically as a convenient party to blame, to basically say, look, I can't get these things done because we've got the Republican Senate here. It helps him do the things he wanted to do and enforce the priorities he wanted to enforce instead of having to give in to the progressive left.
Lan He Chen, fellow with the Hoover Institution, and Jessica Levinson, professor with Loyola Law School. Thank you both for joining us and for your insight. And now let's take a look at something beautiful. Tonight we take you to the Solano County city of Benicia. Nestled on the banks of the Carquinez Strait, Benicia was the state capital from 1853 to 1854. You can find more of our news coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Priya D. Clemens. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thanks for joining us. Good night.